Welcome to Cinema on a Shelf, a podcast about movies and physical media. My name is Matt, and thank you for spending some time with me instead of watching a movie. I promise I will try to make it worth your time. Is it worth your time to upgrade your movies? It's kind of what we're talking about today. The whole idea behind today's episode, I'm doing the cheeky little title, to upgrade or not to upgrade. That is today's question. So it's all about the idea of upgrading physical media in your collection, why people upgrade in the first place, what are some of the advantages or reasons that people would want to upgrade the movies that are in their collection, and what are some of the things to consider and maybe potentially issues that are related to upgrading discs in your collection. This is kind of an interesting topic as far as the whole physical media collecting thing goes, because this is something that is not really a necessity if you're collecting. You know, you can decide that you want to just collect any movies you can possibly find and be perfectly happy with that. And that's great. You know, upgrading a certain copy to another copy is something that a lot of people may never do. But there is a lot of people that do enjoy upgrading certain things. Obviously, technology has gotten, better and better and higher definition, and, has expanded to include a lot more things over the different life cycles. Even if you think of going from VHS days to DVD and really having the ability on DVDs and Blu-rays and so forth, even Laserdiscs, to be honest with you, to have some supplemental materials and higher quality visuals. There's always been that in physical media. And these days, it sort of boils down to mostly the three most available formats for physical media, being DVD, Blu-ray, and 4K UHD, kind of going in order of older or least high quality. Not that DVD is low quality, certainly, but from lowest to highest as far as the resolution. So why would someone want to upgrade a movie? What are some of the reasons that, a collector might look at their film collection and say, I really want to take this DVD that I have and upgrade it to a higher format, or I want to take a Blu-ray and upgrade it to a 4K, or maybe I just want to upgrade from, one Blu-ray to a different Blu-ray. What are some of the reasons that people would decide to do that? Well, I think probably the most cited reason for this is the idea of better quality in some way, shape, or form. Often this is coming from quality of picture. So I mentioned DVD being kind of the first HD high definition kind of version of physical media, home video, and Blu-ray being, even greater fidelity than that, and 4K being even greater than that. Oftentimes, even when you're taking a similar transfer, let's say if you have the same print of a movie and put it onto DVD, Blu-ray, and 4K, there is going to be, different amounts of noticeable differences, but there will be a bit of fidelity difference, especially when you're looking at, current 4K TVs and things like that. They sometimes don't always look as good with some of the older DVDs or ones that haven't been fully mastered for that format. There are, there's some exceptions to that, obviously. I know my last episode, the Criterion Hall of Fame episode that I just did and talked about Downhill Racer. Downhill Racer, I reviewed on DVD. I have that DVD, and certain things that I'd read online is that the Blu-ray that's available from Criterion is the same transfer and the same restoration, and it does look better, but the DVD does also look very good. So, there's different varying levels of kind of the upgrade in picture quality that can be there in going from one format to another, or even in the same format. And part of that has to do with the idea of a restoration. So films will often go through periods where they're being restored for a new high definition master, or they maybe have, some damage to an original negative, or maybe just have some, dust over time and they're cleaning up, especially with older films. They can go through a restoration and really kind of be put into a new high definition master that looks, really, really good, a lot cleaner, a lot sharper potentially. And, even moving from like maybe more of a standard, let's say a standard Blu-ray, to maybe a boutique Blu-ray, or another company that is doing their own restoration. Sometimes it can even be an upgrade for that. I know I have a few films that I have, got an upgrade for on the same format, going to a boutique label, and it has looked better on the boutique restoration, whether they were able to put more time in, maybe they, had involved some of the filmmakers to get a little bit more say onto, what they're restoring, what it looked like, getting it back to kind of the original vision or the original negative, or restoring it as best they could. So restoration does play a big part in that, and I think a lot of people do look at, oh, something's coming out in a restored version, and that would be a reason for them to upgrade. Another part of that is sound. Obviously, sound upgrades are also a big deal, even though they may not necessarily be as like immediately noticeable as a picture or a visual. Having, upgraded sound scores, upgraded dialogue, something a little bit clearer. If you have a film that is maybe a little bit newer and is being mixed more for surround sound, or I'm not a huge THX Dolby Atmos kind of person, but there are certain films and restorations that will have some increase in the sound style, the sound quality, the surround sound capabilities that will go into it. So that would also be a potential reason why somebody would want to upgrade a disc to, a better quality in terms of sound. As I mentioned, the improvement in the fidelity and the high def format is definitely a reason that a lot of people would want to do an upgrade, especially if you're looking at some of the older DVDs that may have been available in sort of the fledgling years of DVD. There's actually quite a few older DVDs that were still, put into the quote-unquote full frame format. This was something that was a little more of a popular practice when before widescreen TVs were ubiquitous, when they still had the 4:3 more square, closer to square aspect ratio on TVs at home. People didn't necessarily, in some cases, prefer having the black bars on the top and bottom, the letterboxing style, and wanted the full frame and would do a pan and scan version of this. I've talked about this in previous episodes. I'm sure it's been talked to death ad nauseum on, many movie videos, podcasts, opinion pieces written down. Full frame is not tremendous, especially if that's not the original aspect ratio of a film. So upgrading from an older DVD that was full frame to something that is widescreen, I think, is pretty much a no-brainer at this day and age, with widescreen TVs being the standard, widescreen, computer screens being the standard, pretty much anything, even a cell phone, if you're watching something on there, it's going to be in a widescreen aspect ratio format. So the full frame is pretty much obsolete at this point. So those older DVDs definitely would be something that people would probably want to upgrade in these days. Some films that have been on DVD have only really been available in more of like a substandard quality. And, this is, I think, something that does change over time, our ability to remaster and restore things for the modern age, even from the early days of DVD to the later days. And now, the restoration is so much better looking even on DVD. So something, and there's a lot of films that were sort of just either relegated to the back burner, maybe were in the public domain if it's an older film, and certain companies would just produce these, quick, cheap and dirty kind of versions of films like Charade with Cary Grant and Audrey Hepburn, that I know was in the public domain for a long time and kind of available in these like shoddy looking, very blurry prints. And they eventually then it was picked up by Criterion, has a great version of Charade, and became a little bit more of like, oh, okay, yeah, if you have one of these old ones, you might have bought it for like $3 or $4 brand new at some point, but it does show its age because of the quality it was presented in. There wasn't any restoration. It was just like, we'll just slap it on the disc and sell it to people. More recently, there's been a bit of a movement and an effort to do a restoration on some other films that have been super sought after in the physical media and movie community, which is the Hong Kong Golden Princess action films. So these are films like John Woo's The Killer and Hard Boiled and A Better Tomorrow. In fact, the whole Better Tomorrow trilogy has been available. Ones like City on Fire. A lot of these films have now, after being available in these kind of, I don't know exactly what I would call the older or more original versions of these films. They were sort of in that period in the late 80s and early 90s where it was just before film stocks and things were getting better digitally, and a lot of these films were shot with, they just look in a way where you kind of go like, this looks very late 80s to me, and they were never really kind of properly restored onto a higher definition format. In fact, they were out of print for a long time in North America, and Shout Factory and Arrow Films have both started to undertake some restorations of these films, and they pretty much across the board have been a pretty big upgrade as far as the quality goes. So they have been quite popular releases because of that, and because those films are very popular and sought after, that having these older, maybe less than ideal quality DVDs that were available before, now we can get some great versions of it. So a lot of people have been looking to upgrade their versions of those films. As different editions of films do also get released on disc, there are, more or even improved supplemental features that become available. Whether it's a new commentary track getting recorded, new interviews, new documentaries, any of those films, or even just sometimes collecting different supplemental features that were available on different discs. If a company put out an early version and then a couple of different versions of that film and like added more supplements but didn't put all of them on there, some of the newer releases do kind of compile a lot of what's available. So that would also be a reason that people would want a certain version or upgrade what they have, is to kind of get everything they could possibly get if it's a favorite film of theirs, or if they just find it a really interesting deep dive. The supplements can play a big part in that as well. There's also some collectors that, really do have a bit of a preference for a specific edition. This oftentimes takes the form of a specific boutique label version. Personally, I'm somebody that really, I think, does this with certain ones. I know Criterion is a big one with that. Film companies like Arrow Video are starting to put out some editions of things that may have been previously available in other versions, and people really love Arrow stuff, and they do fun artwork and things like that. So they you may look at an Arrow release and go, yeah, that is the one that I want in my collection because I really love Arrow, I really love Criterion or anything like that. And they, just love having that boutique labels version of a film that they did previously have, and they may want to upgrade because of that. I think probably the most popular, or the one you hear about the most when it comes to upgrading, is you may just want your favorite films in the highest possible format that's available. You hear about people going like, yeah, I love Jurassic Park, and I've owned it on VHS and DVD 2 different times, and a collector's edition, and then a Blu-ray, and then a definitive version, and a restoration, and then a 4K. There are people that will really just like, hey, I have like my favorite 20 movies of all time, and I just want to get the highest quality version that's available of that. And when a new version comes out, then they add it to their collection, sometimes to replace an old version. Have also seen people that are just like, I have 9 copies of this James Bond movie because it's my favorite. That's something that a lot of collectors will do as well. But like kind of identifying your favorites and wanting to own something that is the highest quality format that's available. That's another reason that people would want to upgrade a film that's in their collection, or maybe add to their collection with a higher quality version. There are probably some other reasons that people would want to upgrade as well. This is just more of a little bit of an intro to some of the main reasons I could think of that myself or other collectors may want to upgrade films that they already have. And when you go about doing that, or starting to think about it, or even going out and like searching for what upgrades someone wants in their collection, there are a lot of things to consider with this. And there's, obviously a lot of things that will play into, whether or not you want to do this. Is that, if this is the kind of collector that you've decided you want to be, if you're curating your collection where you want to continually upgrade and kind of replenish things that you've got, versus if you're somebody that wants to, be in it to just kind of compile and get new stuff at the moment, or you're just looking for whatever's available at the cheapest. Honestly, that maybe, maybe there isn't really much of an issue, and that's just how you go about it. But if you do decide to get into the practice of upgrading films in your collection, there are a few things that you sort of need to consider and probably can weigh as far as when you're searching for specific films. And one of the biggest ones that I think I've come across more often than anything else in any time I've had an upgrade in my collection is the fact of availability. So films are not always constantly available or in print. The rights for these things change over time. They may go from one label to another and back again, and have different restorations. And around the world there's obviously different rights holders. If you have a certain film that you own in North America, if you're in Europe, there may be a completely different rights holder that's there. And not all films that have ever been released, and let's say on DVD, because DVD is the format where the most films at one point have been available with the current kind of big three formats, not everything that's been released on DVD is available on Blu-ray or 4K. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The DVDs have been cheaper to produce than Blu-rays and 4Ks. And they're just used to, when DVD had its heyday, there was definitely a lot more of, physical marketplaces for people to go out and browse for movies and take a chance on something they might see right in front of them. There's a lot less of these stores now, with places like Best Buy no longer having the catalogs or any physical media really in terms of movies. That, if you were a smaller film, you could take a chance as an independent, producer on making, a few thousand copies of this film that not a lot of people have seen, that, or maybe even heard of, but get it into a store, and someone may look at that and go, oh, I'll take a chance on this. That happens less and less. So, not everything gets put onto the high def, the Blu-ray 4K formats, because there's also, a cost of restoration to go from a DVD master onto Blu-ray. Otherwise, it's really not going to look very good at all. So why would people spend the money on it? There are also, like I said, the region differences. So there are certain films that different, producers, let's say boutique labels in Europe, thinking of someone like Eureka or 88 Films or Indicator, that they may have the rights to produce maybe a region-free version, but they also may just have the rights to do it region 2 or region B, depending on what the format is. And it may just come across that and I've had this happen a lot of times, where some films that I've been searching for that I want to add to my collection aren't available in North America for me. And until I get a region-free player, there isn't really any way to own it at home at this point in time. So that's something to consider as well, especially if you're looking at, films from other countries. They don't always have releases everywhere around the world. There are also certain genres or certain types of films that, kind of more typically were only available on DVD. And the one I could think of with this is documentaries. Seems like a lot of times documentaries found a bit more of a home on DVD, and even to this day kind of at times continue to, because, documentaries, not everybody is as into watching documentary films as, as maybe like a regular narrative type of film. There are exceptions to that, obviously, and a lot of fantastic documentaries out there, but they do tend to have a little bit of a smaller audience a lot of the time. And where they might find that audience might be somewhere either that is quite niche, or might be somewhere like a public library. A lot of libraries do have pretty good collections of things like documentaries that people can look up, whether it's for research purposes or otherwise. And I have found a lot of the time that if there's a documentary that I do want to add to my collection that I'll look for, especially if it's a little bit older or maybe not as modern, I have a far, better likelihood of finding a DVD of that documentary than I do of a Blu-ray or a 4K. If it's a little bit newer, then they're usually available on the newer formats. But, there are a lot of them that just kind of have DVD only versions available. And, that is just fine, but that is something that, may mean that it's maybe out of print at the moment and maybe was made in smaller quantities on DVD, so may potentially be tougher to find. Another in the kind of potentially tougher to find aspect of things is many of the manufacture on demand titles may only have ever been manufactured for the DVD format. And I have talked about Warner Archive as being like a manufacture on demand that formerly used to do kind of that model primarily and only on DVD and a little bit on Blu-ray, and now does a little bit wider spread stuff. Warner Archive wasn't the only label. The Universal Vault is one of them. The 20th Century Fox Cinema Archive was one of them. This was a pretty popular, manufacture on demand process for older films and for, titles that were in a larger catalog of a major studio. Was also something that I know the National Film Board of Canada did for some time, where they would manufacture titles on demand. I do have a couple in my collection of NFB stuff that, I really enjoy and wanted to own. And some of them, they did do some bigger packaging and something a little bit more like for the marketplace. But the manufacture on demand titles were kind of mostly done that way because they didn't want to, spend the money up front to make a few thousand copies, because they didn't think that they would maybe sell as many of them. And maybe they did it originally to gauge whether or not they would do a larger release, and they never did. So some of those titles, you're kind of at the mercy of how many were actually manufactured. And with a lot of these services now, they don't exist in the kind of format that they did 10, 15 years ago. So they may potentially be a little bit harder to find, and you may only find them on DVD. So availability plays into kind of all of those factors of what you may actually be able to find. And kind of keeping going onto that idea, another issue related to upgrading is going to be the idea of whether something is in print versus whether something is out of print. So I mentioned rights holders already. The rights for releasing films on physical media are not necessarily forever. They are, finite deals in certain capacities. And, the rights may change hands. They, agreements may lapse. And maybe nobody has rights for a certain amount of time, where people are holding on to it and not producing a physical media version, which means that certain editions of films can go out of print. And this even happens to, newer editions, things like somewhere like Kino Lorber, which is a label that does do a pretty big volume of films available on physical media. There will be times where after a couple of years of something being available, the original contract is maybe that they had the rights to distribute it for 2 years, and then it gets revoked, and then maybe the rights go somewhere else. Maybe they just kind of are in limbo. And that can have an effect on not only what's available out there to purchase, but obviously with things also getting more expensive and harder to find, whether it's in stores or on secondhand markets. This most definitely happens with certain films that do maybe change hands more frequently, or ones where the rights go back and forth. There's certain companies that I think have a little more of a business practice or a track record of doing smaller release windows, or maybe having, retaining rights back after a certain amount. Somebody like Studio Canal is one that has done different editions of things in the past, where they may have licensed films out to Kino Lorber or Criterion or Eureka or somebody else, and those rights have lapsed, and then Studio Canal maybe takes them back and does their own versions of things. That has happened with a lot of films that they've done. Films like The Third Man, has gone from several different editions in Criterion to then reverting back to Studio Canal, and most recently they've done a 4K of it. I'm not picking on Studio Canal at all with that. A lot of businesses and a lot of companies will do that, where the rights go back and forth, or maybe there's, they just decide to do a different deal with someone. So these out-of-print editions, especially if it's an out-of-print edition of a boutique label, if they go out of print, that usually does mean that they are going to go up in price if you're looking at them, on the secondhand online marketplaces, or even in secondhand stores that may carry some of that stock. They sort of know and see the market value of what things go for. And that obviously gets dictated by how much people are buying it. Just because a film goes out of print doesn't mean the price is necessarily going to go up if there's not as much demand for it. And that has certainly been the case. But yeah, the idea of, if a film does go out of print, or a specific edition can go out of print, this can make it more expensive or more difficult to find. I know I've run into this with, I mentioned doing a little bit of collecting of Billy Wilder's films. There's a couple of them that really fit this bill that have editions that have gone out of print and have not come back yet, and they're quite expensive on some of those markets. So you get to sort of weigh your options of, do you fork out a whole bunch of money? Is it a film that you do want to spend that money on? Or do you wait and see if it comes back in print? It's always something to consider in the whole idea of upgrading. Kind of going in that same vein is not necessarily editions that go out of print, but what happens when maybe a specific label or producer goes out of business. If you have a defunct label, they oftentimes will have a pretty good catalog with them, or maybe even a small catalog that they were one of the only ones that made certain films available. So there may be some films that have been available on Blu-ray, on a boutique label, that are no longer in business. And there are a couple of more higher profile versions of this, two of them specifically being Twilight Time and Olive Films. These were both kind of companies that were created with a little bit of an idea to release some back catalog stuff from other major labels that are not Warner Brothers. So the Warner Archive is kind of the version of this that still exists. Twilight Time was one that they, were really heavily involved with licensing out films. A lot of what they licensed out was from 20th Century Fox. So, there are certain films that they released on Blu-ray that have not come back available on Blu-ray. Some of these are older films, ones like the Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, the Ronald Neame film starring Maggie Smith, the Oscar-winning film for Maggie Smith. It currently exists as an out-of-print Twilight Time Blu-ray, and that's it. Another, older one, Two for the Road, with Albert Finney and Audrey Hepburn, kind of a not quite a screwball comedy, like a romantic comedy where the couple's bickering at each other. Like it's a pretty classic film. It's actually a really fun film. It really hasn't been available on Blu-ray since Twilight Time did it, so it's been out of print and unavailable for a long time. Breaking Away is a film from the late 70s with a very young Dennis Quaid and Jackie Earle Haley about four friends stuck in a small town, and one of them has this dream and aspiration to become a cycling racer on like the Tour de France. It's a very fun film. It's actually a really good like small town film and also a pretty fun sports film. And it is not available anywhere on Blu-ray currently. That's a film I could actually see coming back. Honestly, all of these I could see coming back at some point. But right now they're not. Even newer films, getting into the 2000s, Jonathan Glazer's Sexy Beast is one that I think is a pretty glaring omission for a filmmaker that now is pretty widely known. His filmography is built up and built up over his years of, in the 90s and 2000s doing commercials and music videos. And he only has, I believe, 4 feature films: Sexy Beast, Birth, Under the Skin, and The Zone of Interest. Zone of Interest being one, Zone of Interest and Under the Skin both were done by A24, and Zone of Interest being one that won Best International Feature at the Oscars was a huge deal. And Sexy Beast is a fantastic film that currently doesn't have an in-print Blu-ray. And the same would have been true for Birth until very, very recently, when Criterion put out a Blu-ray and a 4K edition of it. So I wouldn't be surprised if we got an edition of Sexy Beast pretty soon, but right now it's in limbo because it was on Twilight Time, and when Twilight Time went under, these 20th Century Fox films were not available. Twilight Time also did have some films from other studios. Columbia Pictures was another one they did quite a few with. And some of their older films, ones like the original Born Yesterday with Judy Holliday, Funny Lady with Barbra Streisand, the follow-up Funny Girl. The Blue Lagoon is one that's from the 80s that is a Columbia film that Twilight Time did an edition of, and it just has not been re-released since then. So if you are, upgrading an older DVD copy of any of those films that I've mentioned, because the DVDs do exist out there, then it's probably going to cost you quite a bit of money, or at least would be costing more than what it would have been available, at retail at the time, which does happen over time. But a lot of these are inflated. I did have a look actually at a couple of these to see what some of the prices were. I think the one that was maybe the most expensive that I looked at was The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. I think right now it's something like $130 to go and get that one. And that's what can happen with some of these titles, is if the label does go defunct, then these can get pretty expensive. Not always the case. And with Olive Films, the other one I mentioned, they're one that has a little bit of both ends of these things. So Olive Films was created basically as a way for Paramount Pictures to put out some of their back catalog and library in the same way that Warner Archive was doing. So the Olive Films line was the one that was kind of chiefly involved with putting those out. A lot of the Olive Films editions didn't have too much in the way of special features. There's a few here and there, but they were a little bit more concerned with like putting things out in a high def edition than they were of getting too much of a deep dive in there. And they did actually have their own line that dove a little bit further into it, called Olive Signature, which they released, I think 12 or 13 editions. I actually have almost all of them in my collection. But they, would take some of them that were a little bit more maybe in demand or prestigious. So, ones like Johnny Guitar, the Western with Joan Crawford and Sterling Hayden, directed by Nicholas Ray, one of the, in my opinion, one of the great Westerns of all time. A very feminist take on Westerns, which is very interesting. Operation Petticoat, which is a great kind of comedy with Tony Curtis and Cary Grant, with a Pepto-Bismol pink submarine. I will say no more there. They also did some pretty high-profile films like the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers and High Noon, even some a little bit newer. I think the last Olive Signature film that was done was Bound by the Wachowskis, and that one's now available on Criterion, because obviously Olive Films did go out of business, and so most of those films, are now out of print. Johnny Guitar hasn't been re-released, neither is Operation Petticoat. There's also some that were just on the regular Olive Films line, like Billy Wilder's Fedora, that has not found an edition anywhere else. And then some newer films as well, like Eight Men Out from the late 80s and Saved, which is a film that my wife and I did on our other podcast, actually, on I Can't Believe You Haven't Seen. And when I went to go source a physical copy of it, we got a DVD of it because it was pretty more readily available than definitely a lot more expensive Olive Signature or Olive Films Blu-ray that was out there. So, the availability of these films can really affect your desire to, or the issue of it being like, yeah, okay, it is expensive. Do I want to spend the money for that? And maybe I don't upgrade a DVD that I had, or maybe if I'm getting it for the first time, you get a DVD instead of the Blu-ray. In Olive Film's case, and actually even in Twilight Time's case, they do have editions from there that are not maybe quite as high profile or quite as in demand in the secondary market, and they can be sourced for, a pretty decent price. So it's not like everything automatically gets inflated with that, but that is, something to consider if you're looking at upgrading some of these movies that may only have editions of defunct labels. Now, I mentioned money a couple of times, and, this is, I think, another big consideration with upgrading films. And if you're going from, a DVD to a Blu-ray to a 4K, DVD to a 4K, even maybe a Blu-ray to a Blu-ray, a lot of times if you're upgrading, it kind of goes hand in hand that very likely it's going to be the more expensive format. Even if you're going from a Blu-ray to another Blu-ray, it's usually, a bigger edition. Maybe it's a steelbook or a collector's edition or a boutique label. So there is probably going to be a bit of an increase in what you would pay for it. And you always have to weigh that option of, is it worth it to me as a collector to spend that money and invest it in a film I technically already do own? And you have to weigh that. Don't just go about it saying, I'm just going to upgrade absolutely everything, because it is going to cost a chunk of money. And, that could go to brand new movies if you wanted it to. So if you do decide to go the upgrading way, your budget and the money that it is going to cost to upgrade should be something that you always consider as to whether or not it's going to be worth it and worth the dollars that you have. The other thing, and this is maybe something that I think is not necessarily newer, but I think has come up recently in the past number of years in terms of new transfers and restorations of films being made available on Blu-ray and on 4K. And I'm not necessarily somebody that gets super in the weeds with this myself. I've mentioned that before on different episodes, but the idea of a new transfer or a restoration having certain changes to how it looks, or maybe having some differences about it, is something that will rub people different ways. Some people don't really have too much of a concern about this. If it's getting upgraded and the look changes a little bit, that doesn't bother a lot of people, and that's completely fine. There are also certain people that will look at it and go, this doesn't look right, this doesn't look different, like, or it looks different from maybe when they saw it in theater, or something about it. There's been some pretty high profile versions of this that the filmmakers themselves have been involved in. I think probably the highest profile one in the last few years, if you're on anywhere online looking at cinema stuff and physical media, is some of the James Cameron films, whether it's Terminator 2 or I'm trying to think of some of the other ones that had some issues. Terminator 2 was one I think that was a big one where there was some, and I don't know a lot of the details of this, but there were people that were upset about the 4K of Terminator 2. There were also some people that had some issues with some of the Wong Kar-wai films that had been updated on the Criterion Collection works of Wong Kar-wai Blu-ray 4Ks that were available, specifically differences from the older versions that were on Criterion. I know Chungking Express was one film in particular that people were maybe had some strong preferences on whether they liked the newer upgraded version or preferred the older version. Wong Kar-wai was involved with those, so it's there, it wasn't like this wasn't a George Lucas situation where he was changing things in films. It was some looks and some filters and colorations and color grading and palettes. Your mileage may vary on this as a concern. I think there is also a consideration. I mentioned George Lucas, and again, not to throw too many people under certain buses, but there have also been editions where filmmakers have gone back and made changes to their own films. Star Wars is a pretty famous example of this. There has been, some chatter about David Fincher with films like Seven getting released on 4K recently and having some kind of a change to it. Again, if you're interested or concerned about that, there's lots of resources online about it. I'm by no means an expert because, on a case by case basis, I'm not sure how much that means to me or not. I would have to do a little bit more deep diving myself. But I do know that a lot of, podcasts and videos and channels and people that talk physical media love to get in the weeds of some of these details and, have preferences about it. And that's great if that's the type of collector that, you really enjoy those small details and you want absolutely the finest quality, then that's something that you're going to be concerned with. So it is something to think about as far as, when you're upgrading. Sometimes it may look a little bit different, or maybe, the full on move to 4K maybe loses something for some people. Again, your mileage will vary as to what you prefer with that, or even what you'd like out of these new editions. Now, outside of some of those technical details, the whole idea of like jumping and upgrading from one format to another is something that you also do probably need to think about and evaluate if you're thinking of upgrading. Especially, when you look at the jump from going from a DVD to a Blu-ray or 4K versus a Blu-ray to a 4K, or a Blu-ray to another Blu-ray, or even a 4K to another 4K. You do get, when you move from DVD to one of the higher formats, there is usually a pretty big jump in quality. And that's a blanket statement, and it's potentially not always correct. There's always exceptions to any rule or thought out there. But going from DVD to something higher quality is usually a pretty big jump. Pretty noticeable jump, especially with modern TVs and screens that you would be watching your physical media on. Now, going from a Blu-ray to a 4K, or a Blu-ray to an upgraded Blu-ray, or even a 4K to a different 4K transfer, sometimes there is a jump, certainly, and there are times in comparisons that can be very noticeable, but it is a less exponential jump going from a Blu-ray to 4K versus the DVD to a Blu-ray, let's say. And again, this is sort of the same debate that if you're a video gamer, this is a little bit of the video game debate of, newer console, better graphics, or newer graphics card in your gaming PC, better visuals. Does the better visual make for better games? Not necessarily. I'm a retro video game guy as much as I love new stuff. It doesn't necessarily have to be the highest fidelity to be a good game. In fact, there's some really high fidelity graphical games that are not very good. And, jumping up from a Blu-ray to a 4K may make all the difference to some people, and it may not make a lot of difference to others. And that's completely fine. There are, personally, I think there are moments where I have had a Blu-ray and have upgraded something to a 4K and have noticed an incredibly large difference. I think the one that I've mentioned on a previous episode, actually on the Warner Archive episode, is John Ford's The Searchers. The 4K of that one that is probably the one 4K that I own that is like, this is a revelation compared to the Blu-ray that I had before. It is pretty stunning, and that's the only one that I own that I know I was like, whoa, this is a big deal. Other ones that I've had Blu-rays of and have upgraded to 4Ks, most of the time you can notice it's like, yeah, okay, this does look really good and look a little bit better, but it's not a massive wow compared to The Searchers, or compared to, let's say, a lot of films I have on DVD that I've upgraded to Blu-ray that are a little bit more noticeable, a little bit more exponential in that jump. So with that in mind, you do have to ask yourself, is the upgrade worth it to you for how you watch movies, what you're watching movies for, and what's important to you when you're watching movies at home? Because some people honestly may be perfectly happy with the DVD copy that they have, and that's great. It really is. That is the way that you collect, and you get to do it the way you want to do it. I think the thing I find with, and I love so many podcasts and videos and channels that do physical media stuff, because they really do get in the weeds, and that's great, because you need people to be able to compare. It's like car, reviews, whether it's online or anywhere. You do need people to be able to get into the nitty gritty of comparing this to that, or a bunch of different things to each other. But at the end of the day, you get to pick what of that matters to you. And that's kind of the way it goes with upgrading. So to sort of tie this conversation together, I thought it was maybe interesting to talk a little bit about my own tendencies when it comes to upgrading films in my collection. Because as I've mentioned already, it's something that I have done before and I will do in the future for certain capacities. But I thought it was maybe a good idea to give a little bit of context to show that, not all of these are necessarily things that you need to consider, or may even be issues for you if you are deciding to upgrade films in your collection. So over the past few years for myself, I have slowly started to look at the films that I have on DVD, because I do still have a decent amount of DVDs in my collection, and doing a little bit of researching on which ones I want to upgrade. Now, I've been collecting movies since a long time ago, like more than 20 years. I think 2003 was the first DVD player I bought, if I remember correctly. So I've been buying DVDs for a long time, and the technology and the restorations have come a long ways. Boutique labels, all of these things, and I do really enjoy that idea. And, a few years ago, I had done a little bit of upgrading before that, but never really consciously thought about it. And I started to look at some of the films that I had on DVD and go, okay, what's available, first of all? What's still in print on a newer edition that I can do some easy upgrading on, whether it's going to a secondhand store or maybe taking advantage of sales, whether it's Black Friday or somewhere you might be able to get a pretty cheap edition of something on Blu-ray that would allow me to upgrade a DVD that I've had. And if it's a film that is not necessarily one that like is a incredibly must see on high fidelity kind of thing, it maybe that one gets deprioritized in favor of some other ones, or maybe other ones that are more of my favorites to do. So that's something that I think I've started to do, and is going to be an ongoing process through probably the next many years of my life. There are certain things that I do have on DVD that aren't available to upgrade, and that I have sourced that I just am like, I'm not sure if this is ever going to exist on a higher quality version, or maybe it doesn't exist in North America, and maybe if I do go region free in the future, then maybe that's where an upgrade could happen. That's future Matt's problem, not current Matt's problem. But it is something that I am conscious of. I'm not spending like an incredible amount of money in the immediate future on it. Just trying to go a little bit at a time, and giving myself some time to sort of see that, like, yeah, some of these upgrades that I do have on DVD that I would want to make are, for me, a little expensive at the moment. I mentioned Billy Wilder's Fedora on all of films. The edition I have of that in my collection is on DVD, which I actually was able to find I was very fortunate to find it for a very low price, and that's great. It's a pretty good edition of that film. There is a Blu-ray of it available that is worth in the neighborhood of $80 to $90 on eBay and online, different online marketplaces. And like Fedora is a fun film, but it's not one that I feel the need to spend that kind of money on upgrading. Would I like to upgrade it? Sure, it would be great. But for that amount of money, it's not something that I'm interested in doing an upgrade on. And, the Olive Film ones are out of print right now, which is why the price is what it is. And, that is that I find with some of them. And some of the DVDs I have, I am willing to spend a little bit of money to do an upgrade on, but I also am pacing myself with that. If there's a few that I know are going to be a bit of an expensive upgrade if I would like them. And I'm in some cases okay with that, but I am trying to, space out, give it a little bit of time to consider that. And part of that is also in terms of patience. And I have found over the past number of years that patience for certain releases has paid off for me in several cases. So there's certain films that I have wanted to upgrade on DVD that maybe something wasn't quite available or out of print at certain times that I've waited on and held off on, and new editions have come out. And I've kind of learned this from being a record collector. There's a lot of records that are also, not in print, or maybe were put out at a time like in the early 2000s when the vinyl resurgence wasn't really too much of a thing. So there may have been a very small run LP version of an album I love, and it's maybe not available, but things come out. Anniversaries happen and bands say, hey, let's do a 20th year reissue of this album. Or maybe just slowly there's a company that decides, hey, we're going to do a color pressing of this and put it back in print. Or maybe it changes hands with record labels. The same thing most definitely applies to physical media. And movies will be reacquired. I mentioned the Golden Princess Hong Kong films. They had been reacquired after a period of being out of print and have been restored. And, I was able to upgrade my copy of John Woo's The Killer to the Shout Factory 4K version. And I was just patient with that one, and it paid off. Arsenic and Old Lace, one of my favorite old comedies with Cary Grant in it. It was a film that Criterion picked up several years ago, and I had an old Warner Brothers DVD snapcase version. If you know the kind of packaging it is. But Criterion did an upgrade of it with collecting a lot of special features, and that was great. I was patient with that one, and it paid off. Also paid off, more recently, maybe about a year ago, when I was able to buy the Arrow Video 4K version of the film Witness with Harrison Ford and Kelly McGillis from the 80s. And that was an upgrade from a DVD that I had from a thrift store. And, I was, again, patient with that one, and it did eventually come back out. And even ones that I totally would not expect. And actually, I didn't even really realize this until I was doing research for this episode, but there's a wonderful documentary called The Celluloid Closet, which I have on DVD and paid a bit of money for because it's been out of print for a long time. And it's a documentary about the history of gay and lesbian characters in Hollywood. And, it's this just really great set of interviewing different filmmakers and writers and actors. And, it just was sort of not really available anywhere except for this DVD that had been long out of print. And Sony Picture Classics has recently reissued this film on Blu-ray and 4K. And I just realized that this week, last week when I was researching, whenever it was. So I'm pretty excited that it's now available again, and I will be really happy to upgrade my copy of The Celluloid Closet. So patience can also pay off in terms of upgrading. It's paid off for me. There are some times where, films just, it may take an incredibly long time. There are some films that really doesn't show any signs that they're ever coming out anytime soon, and maybe they won't. You don't want to necessarily be pessimistic about these things, but there are some films that people have been clamoring for on new editions of physical media. I know one specifically that I can think of off the top of my head is The Heartbreak Kid by Elaine May, that is this widely regarded comedy from the 1970s. Elaine May has kind of, had a bit of a moment of people rediscovering her stuff with her film A New Leaf, which originally actually did come out on Olive Films and has recently been reissued on an upgraded 4K by Cinematograph. A lot of people have rediscovered it. It's been available on streaming services, and Criterion Channel had it at one point in time. So like there's this big rediscovery of Elaine May, and The Heartbreak Kid, it has a DVD that is not, I guess, remastered very well. I don't own it. I haven't seen it yet. But, you know, everybody kind of says like, yeah, this would be great to have. So many people would love it. And the rights holders to it just seem to have no interest in restoring it, re-releasing it. This is a long, you know, standing thing, to the point where there's even been like fan restorations online of this film. So, you know, like patience has paid off for me in some of the stuff I've been collecting. Again, your mileage is going to vary as to what you would like to do as far as your own collection. But that's a little bit of insight to how I think about upgrading stuff in my collection. And I would be really interested to hear what some of you think about, you know, do you upgrade stuff in your collection? Are you thinking about upgrading? You know, are certain things maybe really, really worth it? Or what maybe some of your favorite upgrades have been in your collection? Would love to hear from you. I have my Instagram, obviously, at Cinema on a Shelf. You can send me a DM there. I'm on Letterboxd. You can follow me there. I also have an email, cinemaonashelf@gmail.com. I've had some people reach out and chat a little bit about movie stuff. I've really enjoyed that. So definitely feel free. Would love to hear about what you're doing about upgrading your collection, or whether you're not about upgrading your collection at all, whether you're happy with what you have. Also, leave me a comment on the YouTube version of this episode as well. It's a really easy way to interact with me about it as well. I would love to hear from any of you about this topic. If you do want to hear more from me, I already mentioned my other podcast with my wife, I Can't Believe You Haven't Seen, which we actually just watched a movie for our most recent episode, Wes Craven's Red Eye, that did recently get an upgrade on 4K, which was the edition that I purchased to watch for that episode. It was my first time watching it. So if you're interested, check that out. Again, anywhere podcasts are available, Apple, Spotify, YouTube as well. And thank you again, everybody, for listening. Going into the next episode, I do also want to talk about another topic related specifically to collections, before we dive back into another label, which I want to do the episode after that. But going to tackle kind of an interesting and ever so slightly wacky topic about physical media collecting. I want to talk about the weird world of organizing your movies. A lot of opinions about this one, and I look forward to dissecting a little bit of that. So until next time, my name is Matt. Thank you again for listening. Take care.